So, you're all here to hear Kai-Fu Lee, who's the CEO and the founder of Sinovation Ventures. He's based in Beijing. He's here in New York for this week and kindly agreed to meet with this group. We're going to dive into a discussion, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Kai-Fu just briefly before we do that. So first of all, he's post-national, like a lot of Quartz's readers. You were a Taiwan native, and you immigrated to the U.S. in the 7th grade and lived in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Right.
He has an undergraduate degree in computer science from Columbia, where he gave the commencement address last evening, which was well received, I understand. And a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, where he did some pioneering work on machine learning and voice recognition. Kai-Fu worked as a Carnegie faculty member, then went to Apple, then went to Silicon Graphics, went to Microsoft in 1998, and worked both in Beijing and in Redmond for Microsoft. 2005, went to Google, made front-page headlines of business newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, where I was at the time, because you were a sort of pawn in the Microsoft-Google corporate battle of the time, and so there were some lawsuits that went back and forth around that. So you started and ran Google's China operation, and Google actually had impressively expanded its market share in China. And then 2009, you left to found the tech startup investment and incubator Innovation Works. Today that's known as Sinovation Ventures. And your most recent fundraising at the end of last year brought in about $675 million across a China investment fund and an American investment fund, and your portfolio has over 300 companies. Kai-Fu has about 50 million followers on social media, 50, including 1.7 million on Twitter as of last night. There are probably some Columbia undergrads who are following you now, so that number is higher. If you're very lucky, he might one day retweet you. So we're going to dive in. We're going to speak up here for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to take questions for a while, both from in the room and on Facebook Live. And we will finish up by 10 to 10 or so, so that you are able to get out of here by 10 o'clock, and as we promised, and move on to the rest of your day. So among the topics we're going to hit are, as I said, artificial intelligence, the Chinese internet sector, which I think for many of us here is fairly opaque, and hear Kai-Fu's views on these things. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's
That's
a pleasure to be here.
A long wind-up for you.
Thanks.
So I want to start with your career. So the pioneering research on machine learning, voice recognition at Carnegie Mellon, and then Apple, Silicon Graphics, Microsoft, Google, and so forth. Is there any through line? Is there any technical through line between all of these things?
Yeah, there are several through line. I think the first one is artificial intelligence. Each of the companies that worked on cutting edge AI and actually worked on VR at Apple in 1995, and then SGI.
What did VR look like at Apple in 1995?
It was called QuickTime VR, the first product to use the name. We went to the Star Trek holodeck and did a 360 photograph that you could zoom in and out, and we loosely called it VR, and it actually made some money for Apple. So that's one through line. But the other corresponding one is always seem to get in too early. So over time, I've learned the lesson. And then the third one is the connection to China. Yeah. That it was starting at Apple and then SGI. They kept showing me how big the China market can be. And then when I was at Microsoft, I jumped all in, and we built Microsoft Research, which at the time was something most people didn't believe could possibly be successful, because Chinese had 0 papers in all the top publications. And we basically, over the 2 years of my tenure and the many years that followed, ended up training 5,000 Chinese scientists in AI. And China now comprises 43% of Chinese writers comprise 43% of all top journal publications in AI today.
So we're going to come back to that in a minute. You just mentioned you are always too early. What do you mean by that?
I have always been too early, but now I'm just on time for AI.
Okay. Now, at age 55, right?
Yes.
You're finally on time.
Finally on time, yes.
Okay,
yes.
Excellent. What was you, across that career, just before we get into AI, where were you happiest, actually, professionally?
I was happiest probably in 3 times.
Yeah.
Starting new things makes me happiest. Doing Microsoft research, starting something with all the freedom from Bill Gates, that was very happy. We hired smart people, did great work, launched their careers. At Google, trying to do something that seemed impossible. We were down to single-digit market share. We got a team and tripled the market share over 3 years. That was fun. And then, of course, at Sinovation Ventures, at a time where no one thought early-stage investment made any sense, and no one thought Android could possibly take off. Everyone was into Symbian. A few loved iOS, but everybody else, Android didn't work. But we said, this is the future, and we basically bet the farm, and then that worked. That was fun. And of course, now it's the most fun, because like Steve Jobs said, now I can connect all the dots and help make AI a reality. And that's the most fun ever.
So let's go into AI. So why do you believe that AI is a profound technology development as opposed to a buzzword that will come and go?
Because I think it's a confluence of several things. One is the invention of deep learning 7 years ago. That was the single factor that made AI work algorithmically. For those of you who don't know, it's kind of a black box. Think of it as a black box Excel. You throw data at it, and it learns to predict and make decisions. Right? You throw financial data at it, tells you what stock to buy. Throw loan data at it, tells you if it's going to be a bad loan. You throw Go data at it, tells you where to place your pieces. So this black box mathematical training technology is the #1 factor, but also helped greatly by the advances in size of data, because deep learning doesn't work with inadequate data. When you've got tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pieces of data, it does magic. It's unlike people. We learn now a couple of exemplars, and deep learning needs huge amounts of data, and now we can get it because through internet finance, we have data. And then lastly, we have computing. With CPU plus GPU, such as the ones from NVIDIA, we can process the massive amount of data. So confluence of 3 things is what gives rise to a lot of companies that are doing well. I'll give you a couple examples from our investment. We invested in the largest AI image processing company in China. It beautifies selfies. And it has 1.3 billion users. Every time you take a selfie and save it, it's a positive exemplar. If you don't save it, it's a negative exemplar. Just keep training. It just makes all of you beautiful in ways that you think are beautiful. Okay? And this is now public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, about a $6 billion valuation. Second company is a payday loan company, but this one makes AI, makes the loan determination, 0 human involvement. Huge data goes in, and you either get the money or not. Anyone on the street can borrow money. It's not a car loan or home loan. It's nothing complex. Just a few pieces of data, and it gives you the money or not. So this year it will underwrite 30 million loans. So imagine the kind of profit that this will yield. We invested in a face recognition company. It can recognize its faces more accurately than people, but not just 3,000 faces, but 3 million faces. So imagine this deployed at all the airports in the world with a database of terrorists and wanted criminals. There will be no more airplane hijacks if the world were to deploy a technology like that.
Which areas do you think of business and society will be most deeply and most immediately impacted by AI?
We think AI will come in 3 phases. They will all happen today, but some will be easy and fast. Some will take its time. Yeah. The first phase is take all the industries that already have big data. So internet, finance, hospitals, medical, education, and so on. The second phase will be create new data that didn't exist before through wearable computing, Amazon Echo, smart cars transmitting your location, and so on, and a new smart traffic, smart city, smart health will happen. The third phase will be when AI starts to move autonomously and smartly, and that will be robotics as well as autonomous vehicles. Overall, these 3, probably 10 to 15 years, but all of them are happening right now. with the first phase, the big data, happening the fastest. And the biggest impact, where the most money will get made, is clearly in the financial industry. So for those of you who are in the financial industry, watch out.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. Which, if hypothetically someone owned stocks of banks or that sort of thing, but which areas of current traditional activity do you think are most vulnerable to, relatively violent disruption? You just mentioned the payday loan company that's making 30 million loans. So finance is clearly one of the areas that you would, that you're bearish on, to use the Wall Street terminology.
Bearish on traditional finances, because numerical analysis and decision making is never the strength of our brain. It is the most extreme case where AI obviously and completely dominates us. So we were forced to become, technical stock analysts, loan officers, and insurance underwriters. But these were never things that we were intended to do, because we don't have the capacity to process all the positive and negative exemplars. We're making decisions based on simplistic if-then-else rules, whereas these AI algorithms are taking a 2,000 dimensional space and making a complex curve that separates people who are safe to lend money or not safe, or stocks that are good to buy and not good to buy. So we're absolutely no match. So those people in those industries will get replaced by machines faster than we think, unless there are antiquated government regulations that prevent that. But that would just be a postponement of the inevitability.
And you personally are experimenting with algorithmic investing, is that right?
Yeah, not experimenting. All the money that I made in the last 3 years have not gone into any human. They're all managed by machines.
So you have the AI algorithms that are managing all of your money. How and are they? You seem like you're relatively happy about this.
Yeah, the returns last year are about 8 times from my private banker. So that reminds me, when I go home, I'm going to fire my private banker.
How do the fees compare?
The fees can be very heavy, because it depends on who you work with. If it's an internal technology developed by Sinovation Ventures, there are no fees.
Yeah.
They just play on my account, and I cross my fingers and hope they will do well. If it's an external person who runs a managed account for you, their carry can be 20% up to 50%.
Yeah.
But they'll guarantee a certain return.
So we talked about finance. Are there any other industries that you think are most challenged profoundly? Transportation is one that people talk about, for example.
Sure. I'll first talk about medical. I'm very, very excited about medical, because you could argue about finance, is it displacing people, cars, are they safe? But medical is just saving lives, and that's phenomenal. The barrier for medical is the way data and privacy and walls between hospitals and countries are erected. So they can't be aggregated in the same way that financial data is. I think collectively as mankind, we have to figure out some way so we can accelerate the cure to cancer and other diseases. But cars, I'm very, very bullish. This will take longer. But the day an autonomous vehicle comes, it's not just another function in the car you buy, because you won't buy cars anymore. Your cars are idle 96% of the time. It's the worst investment you could make. Right? Your house appreciates, your car depreciates. It's only useful because of the 4% convenience it gives you. It's not that convenient. You got to park the car, get valet, pay huge parking in New York. If Uber would come in 30 seconds and charge you 1/3 the rate it does, I think most of you would let go. I think let go of your cars, and that's likely to happen because the human driver is 2/3 of Uber's cost. When they get rid of the human driver, the cost should come down 2/3, and then there will be fewer cars. They'll be more intelligent, know where you are, come faster. Pollution will be gone. Traffic congestion will be gone. Accidents will go way down. One very key thing about AI is it gets better with use and with data. So when I gave you example of our loan company, they lost tens of millions of dollars earlier in bad loans. But when you make enough bad loans, that becomes negative training exemplar, then it gets better. Your bad loan rate drops from teens to low single digit. Similarly, autonomous vehicles initially They might only be as good as human drivers, but over time they'll be much better. So they'll be safer, better for our health and longevity. They'll be more efficient. Cars will become smaller. You can only fit one person in it. It will have better safety devices. You can have more lanes. So all those things will completely disrupt the way of our transportation. Not to mention logistics, delivery, what Uber has done with shipping beers and things like that. Things will be sent to your home. You'll be able to read a newspaper and drink coffee when you're in the car. When you order delivery, it won't just be Amazon Prime, Amazon Fresh. You could have fried chicken that's fried in the car that's delivered to your home. And it'll taste good when it comes out. So think of all this disruption. It's not just a function. It's, easily 20, 30% of the GDP.
But is this 5 years away, 10 years away, 20 years away? The fried chicken in the car I'm most interested in.
I don't know, 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years.
I think technologically we could probably say about 10 years, but there are also legal, moral, user acceptance issues. So I'll be conservative and say 10 to 15.
Yeah. So as you look at the big technology companies, a number of whom you've worked at, how would you assess their strengths going forward? Who's strongest in terms of AI?
I think whoever has more data. The magic thing about the AI is whoever has more data is stronger. Of course, number one measure how much data you got, how structured it is, how useful it is, how accurate label it is. Then measure how good are your AI team and technologies and infrastructure. If you combine and blend these two, Google comes out clearly on top, followed by Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, and then in China, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba. I think these are the 7 giants today.
And how do you, these are all big platforms, and they have tons of data, resources. They can hire the top AI talent for millions of dollars.
Yes.
You're an investor in small companies.
Yeah.
How do you compete with these guys?
Well, we give the people who make $1 million the dream that they can make $1 billion, right? And we show that they can do good for mankind, and they can own their destiny and rather be a pawn. Having said that, it's very difficult to pull people out of these companies because brilliant AI scientists want to be swimming in data because they know that's what feeds their intellect, and these guys have more data. So I sometimes jokingly call these 7 companies the 7 black holes, because the data comes in, scientists come in, they don't come out. Yeah. But we do occasionally pull a few of them out.
Yeah. I want to ask you about shift to the future of work a little bit. This is an area that you have made some predictions, and one of your predictions is that roughly 50% of jobs will be replaced by robots over the next 10 years, actually.
Right.
That's faster than the fried chicken in the car, even.
Yeah.
So what sort of jobs will be affected, and what will happen to the people who otherwise would have filled those jobs?
Right. So this is based on an Oxford study where they said, I think 2 years ago, they said 50% of the jobs in 10 to 15 years. So I think I'm a little more aggressive in the estimate, so 10 years, 50%. One could project that the rate in which the jobs will be replaced, first is any job that requires less than 5 seconds of thinking, right? So a receptionist, a factory worker, with a middleman, that would be the fastest. Then it's jobs that are numeric in nature, where large data is available to make objective, quantitative yes-no decisions. So that would be traders, research analysts, insurance agents, bank officers, loan officers, and then beyond that, things that are a little more complex but still quantitative in nature. So basically, physicians in radiology read X-rays and MRI and CT. Drivers, that's actually pretty complex, but in 10-year time frame, they'll be replaced. And then legal assistants and some lawyers and reporters.
Okay. How long do we have?
I think courts is in good shape because you're catching up with the times. You got your AI practice and
Thank you.
Yeah. But some of your reporters who write shorter, put together articles, those will be done by machines. But you have to keep migrating. For all of these professions, you have to migrate to be the best in order to survive. So if you in aggregate, you add up the types of jobs I have, that's probably close to half.
So what you're describing, there is a dystopian scenario in here, and we've seen this in movies, and there are a lot of people who are, really concerned about this, where you have the 7 black holes on one hand, and then you have lots of people who don't have jobs on the other hand. And the potential is to only exacerbate the inequality that we see already.
Right.
What gives you and you've said that you think that poverty could be eliminated as a result of this. How and would that happen, and what gives you confidence that that your alternative scenario is likely?
Well, it's the best of times and worst of times. It depends on what we make of it, right? All these AI algorithms, they're going to run essentially for free, right? All they take is electricity because networking, hardware, software costs are going down. So they'll be generating more value, doing all the tasks with much higher accuracy, doing tasks that weren't done before, creating a massive amount of wealth for mankind. So if we, as mankind, redistribute the wealth, perhaps using something as dumb as taxation and minimal monthly stipend to the displaced workers, I think will at least minimize the number of people who are stricken with poverty and hunger. That would be a progress. I'm not sure eradicating is possible, but at least make the largest progress yet to mankind. That's the positive part. The downside is what happens to the 50% who are displaced. It's not going to be easy to retrain the displaced people. And I think on the one hand, we have to make sure they're taken care of. They can live with, they're taken care of monetarily. But then I think we have to figure out how to retrain them. And my thoughts would be, we have to study what AI cannot do and let them do what AI cannot do. Otherwise, you help a reporter who used to, write a 200-word article that's replaced. Now we have a 300-word in a year that will be replaced. So that's no good.
Yeah.
So I think, AI will create a lot of jobs. I'll use doctor as an example, right? Imagine for the moment, this may not happen for another 15 years, but imagine for the moment that AI can do diagnostics that is determined based on your symptom, what you have and what drugs you should take with a higher accuracy than human. Imagine that for a moment. I believe it will happen, but imagine that happens in 15 years. Well, a cold diagnostic tool will be very negative, threatening to the patient, right? Imagine if you go and hear that, you have 4th stage lymphoma, there's a 70% chance you'll die within 5 years. That's not good. That's not what you want to hear from a robot doctor. So the role of a doctor can become someone who is more like a social worker, medically knowledgeable social worker, assistant, psychiatrist, psychologist, who says, let's see, what were your symptoms last night? Let me listen. Okay, even though they know it doesn't matter, but they'll ask, and so you feel heard. And every time you say, I have a headache, tell me more about it. I have a temperature. Are you sweating? Basically be very targeted, relevant, caring, so that they feel cared. Then you can give encouragement. It's like, I know this guy named Kai-Fu Lee. He had 4th stage lymphoma. He's okay now. So, maybe you should follow and consider the way he's treated and really go through the regimen of this chemotherapy. It's a little bit painful, but in the end, he's okay. So you got a chance. So this will not only make people feel better, it will make them loved, cared, and also kick in the placebo effect so they have a higher chance of surviving. So this is a transformation of the doctor job. And there may be more doctors in the end, because if your doctor spends 10 minutes with you on each visit, now they can spend 50 minutes. They can come to your home and visit you. They can show love and make you feel better. So now we've increased employment. So that's just an example. But you could have a brilliant concierge, a tour guide, a masseuse, a sushi chef. So all those jobs become irreplaceable by AI.
Yeah.
Service jobs.
And you just mentioned this in passing, but you did share publicly in 2013 you were diagnosed with lymphoma,
yes.
and you're in remission now, and you look
yes.
great. So
yes.
I want to acknowledge that. What do you tell the overachieving New York parents who say, outside on the streets here, rushing their kids off to lessons in school.
Yeah.
They may ask you, like, should my child study engineering? How do we prepare our kids for this uncertain future?
Yeah.
What would you say to them?
I think to let the kids study what they really do well and they have talent, right? If they're a mathematical genius, and maybe they'll be the next person who programs the next robot and make sure it's benevolent, right? But if they're artistically inclined, actually, art and beauty is very hard to replicate with AI. Maybe let them stay with what they do. Given AI is more objective, analytical, data-driven, it's perhaps time for some of us to switch to the humanities, liberal arts, and beauty. And maybe it's a lot of professions that appear to have difficult time finding a job are good to study, because the AI opens new frontiers, right? Think about philosophy, sociology. All AI changes.
So it could actually shift that.
Could shift that, yeah.
We're going to go to questions in a few minutes. I want to ask you, be sure to ask you about China's place in artificial intelligence research and applications. And you mentioned at the very beginning that China represents something like 40% of the academic papers published on AI at this point, from very little, actually not that long ago.
Right.
How would you assess the strength of China as an AI breeding ground, a center, and is it positioned to surpass the position of the U.S.?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Clearly, if you measure the very, very top papers, U.S. and Canada leads the world by far.
Yeah.
Okay. However, AI scientists tend to be very open and sharing in nature. They publish their papers, and also their results are very easily validated and replicable. It's unlike doing biosciences, when all the chemical agents and the medical clinical trials lengthens the time in which you can replicate the result. If you read someone's AI paper, they'll usually tell you what data set they use, what network they use. You can pretty much in a week replicate the same thing. So this actually, the edge actually isn't as large. It's actually the 7 black holes who have the edge, but we don't know what edge they have.
Because they're not publishing.
They're publishing some, but not as much.
Yeah.
Okay, so but we're not comparing the 7 black holes. We're comparing U.S. and China. U.S. is clearly ahead in academics, but it's not as large an edge as it would be in other basic sciences. Secondly, in terms of applications and data, China has more data than in the U.S., right? A lot of apps that we fund initially were not AI companies. The Meitu is the public company, which many of you probably don't use, but maybe you've used Beauty Plus, Makeup Plus. Those are also made by Meitu. So they're now being used across the world with 1.3 billion users, and that amount of data will create a virtuous cycle. So I think, and also, in the future there will be more Chinese cars, perhaps more Chinese autonomous vehicles. So larger market with more data is an advantage that I think is very important, as important as having scientists, if not more. So that's China's advantage. The other thing is the speed at which Chinese entrepreneurs work hard and iterate. When I take the companies I invest in to come visit Silicon Valley, they're in awe about the creativity in Silicon Valley, but they're also shocked how few hours people work in the Silicon Valley. So with this work ethic and dedication in the iteration and use of big data, I remember when I was a grad student, I felt I had a moral obligation to keep the 40 servers that my boss has in his department fully occupied running jobs every day. And that's how we achieved the breakthrough in speech recognition.
Yeah.
And maybe this is kind of the Chinese obsession with maximizing productivity and work. And this is the way that all of our entrepreneurs work. So I think these will bode well for China in terms of using the massive data, hardworking entrepreneurs, creating economic value. And one last advantage that China has is a lot of the industries are very backward. The U.S. quantitative trading is very advanced. To use AI to do better is difficult. But in China, quantitative is new. In the US, credit card fraud without AI is pretty good. To use AI to beat it is difficult. But in China, the credit card fraud is not as good. So there's a lower bar for AI to beat. And also in the US, there are a lot of enterprise companies, software companies already. In Chinese, it's nothing. So I think of that as a glass half full, so that we can have an opportunity to create AI enterprise companies that will have huge valuation and catch up, because AI is fundamentally an enterprise play, not a consumer play.
And are there any specific applications or companies that are world leading in China that we're not seeing here?
Well, the three I mentioned are all world leading.
Yeah.
Face++ is the world's best face recognition system. I think Smart Finance probably has one of the best payday loan AI determination algorithms.
Yeah.
Meitu certainly has the best beautification algorithm. Yeah. It doesn't lead to money directly, but it will.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to go to questions from the folks here. And it's about the Chinese internet players, and you sort of alluded to this. I think there have been a lot of questions over the last few years. To what extent will the big Chinese internet players, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, be successful outside of their home market? And to what extent will US and European companies have an opportunity to succeed inside China? How would you describe the state of that?
Yeah, so this is my informed opinion and conjecture that over the next 5 years, the Chinese companies will be very successful in moving their technologies and products to other developing countries, in particular Southeast Asia, perhaps South America, we don't know, and also, interestingly, Middle East. And we're seeing early signs that the Chinese app developers are, here's the reason. China is like a gladiatorial competition to the death when it comes to the app developers. They really fight hard and they work hard. And when you've survived in China, you can survive anywhere.
Yeah.
So a lot of them are, also some of them are finding it hard to survive in China because of the competition. And they're finding competing overseas in other developing countries to be not that hard. Also India, of course. That's not Southeast China. So that's a lot of the developing countries. We're seeing that trend, and then AI will give them a further strength to do that. Not necessarily Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, but smaller companies, and also companies they invest in locally that borrow their technologies. So I kind of see in 5 years, US continues to solidify its leadership in US English-speaking countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, possibly Japan, and maybe possibly Japan. That will continue to be solidified, but US will lose ground in terms of developing countries. We'll end up with 2 countries dominating kind of 2 parts of the world.
And US firms in China?
No, not likely. There will be examples of success, right? I mean, if Facebook Oculus is really, really good, right, or Microsoft HoloLens is really, really good, I think the example-based success will happen. But I think a sweeping success, like, at the level of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, that's very unlikely, because a lot of people say it's, protectionism. I think that is no longer the main issue. The main issue is the Chinese software stack and user expectation is completely different from the US. So by taking any new app and trying to take it on the Chinese stack is actually very difficult to implement.
And this is an issue for Apple as well, right?
No, Apple actually has its own stack.
Yeah.
So I think Apple is maybe an exception.
But WeChat and other, the Chinese ecosystem operates on the Android phones just as well as on Apple phones.
Yes. So Apple is a relatively complete stack in terms of its, payment, microprocessor, closed unit, developer platform. So it's a little bit immune to the external. But as you said, WeChat and Apple are having some disputes because it's kind of like Microsoft on Mac 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So
Microsoft Office on Mac.
Microsoft Office on Mac, right? Why should I do your platform? And then they have they both have the nuclear weapon on each other.
Yeah.
So they'll have to work something out. That's I think a singular case that's interesting to study. I don't see it generalized a lot.
Okay. All right, so we're going to take questions here, but just raise your hand. We have a microphone. If you could just say your name and your organization briefly. And Erica, do you want to? Great.
Hi, Perry Hewitt. I work for Ithaca, which is digital innovation in higher education. My question is, how do you think about the ethics of AI? You've touched on the moral implications, but when we think about, for example, the use of student data, we wrestle with what's fair game and what's not. How do we advise universities? So I'm curious to see, have you heard of a role of an AI ethicist? If so, where and how? Thank you.
I think that is a role where U.S. will establish leadership and show the rest of the world. I see there's a lot of advocacy for privacy, concern for safety, and I think that's an area that we can only look to U.S. for leadership. And there are some obvious things one could imagine, right? That you can't sell private data, you can't barter private data, you can't use it to do fraudulent or illegal things. Those are obvious things one could do. But I think in terms of privacy in general, largely speaking, all of us are trading some degree of our privacy for convenience. And I think for most of us, there's a balancing act that's generally acceptable. So I think for the ethicists, it would be a question of how to let us keep most, if not all, of the conveniences while avoiding privacy data to be used in illegal or hurtful ways. I don't have anything more profound than hope. If you have ideas, please teach me.
Over here, and then we'll work our way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paul Steiger from ProPublica. How do you think about elements that can frustrate this vision? For example, inequality, dystopian impulses. I mean, we're seeing right now the hacking, not done by a superpower. Maybe it was North Korea. Who knows who it was? But hacking is become a sport that more and more individual players can engage in. Also, frustration at inequality. If you have a positive social impulse to redistribute this extra value that you're creating, that's wonderful. But we're seeing right now the Republican Party in control of the U.S. government for now is pushing toward more inequality with tax cuts for the rich and so on. So one can imagine frustration that can lead to damaging, destroying, frustrating these systems. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, let me list many more frustrations, and then we can work together on the solution. I'm very concerned about the companies that have massive amounts of data. Hacking is one issue. That's obviously a big issue. But I'm also worried about companies that have massive amounts of data all under its black box. None of us know what they're doing with it. They could be doing things that hurt our possessions, our health. We just don't know. They could be extracting privacy data, selling it. It's invisible to us. How do you manage, control, and regulate that? I think that's an issue. I think the inequality, I worry a lot about the 50% workforce. I gave what I thought was one possible solution, but it's easier said than done. Not every factory worker can morph him or herself into a sushi chef or a masseuse, right? And if that doesn't happen, then while we on the Maslow hierarchy, we've solved the hunger problem and the subsistence problem, we have not solved the self-actualization problem. People will be frustrated. They'll go to the streets. And also another worrisome scenario is another technology, VR, will come along. So in 3 or 5 years, they can put on the glass and just go live in an alternate world, essentially live in the Matrix world, or live in a world where they can kill monsters or become the king or have 3 girlfriends or whatever. And that's not healthy for the brain development of people. I also worry about certain famous people like Elon Musk talking about the need for us to become cyborgs. And while one can't scientifically prove whether that's likely or plausible or not, I worry if all of us go in that direction, then any degree of our spiritual heart or humanity may be eradicated. So I'm afraid there are many, many things to worry about. I think the first step we can do is to educate people on the practical engineering realities of AI, which is what I tried to do today. Focus on the real problems that will happen and the real issues that may arise and the real capabilities and limitations of AI today. I guess I would prefer for the engineering-minded people like myself to try to focus on the problems that will surely happen as opposed to the hypothetical problems that may or may not happen, and certainly not to create more hypothetical problems that may become self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think we got so many problems. I would prefer to focus on the ones that are a certainty. I think that 50% unemployment is a certainty. I think some companies with large data doing evil is a certainty. Those are probably the two I would personally focus on because I think we might be able to do something about it and also because they're happening with a certainty, so we better look at it. Education is a third one I think we got to do because even if this generation of displaced workers will be hard to move into a new job, there's no excuse not to let the 5-year-old have the right education so that he or she will have the opportunity that he or she deserves.
We're going to take a few more questions. So we're going to take a question from Facebook Live.
Hi, my name is Beth Ponso. I work here at Quartz. So we have been taking questions from Facebook, and Damon Lau, who's joining us from Utah, asks about the intersection of AI and virtual reality and how these two technologies could be either used together or how they also might conflict.
Sure. I think in virtual reality, speech becomes a very viable interface. As a speech scientist, I struggle a lot on where speech can be used. Speech transcription is the one place that I use speech, but speech understanding is so hard, and people using tactile interfaces seem to beat speech every time. So I think in a virtual environment, it's likely to have interactions with other people and other elements, and also it's kind of a eyes and hands busy scenario. So I think speech-based interfaces might be interesting. Also, I think the natural combination is, while I know a lot of you watch Westworld, right? I think the Westworld as a next step is unlikely because the robotic expectations are too large. The Westworld in the virtual reality is much more possible. And I think on the one hand it's so much fun. On the other hand, I worry about the obsession that it will create. And it clearly requires AI. To build Westworld, you need both VR and AI, and that's probably a virtual Westworld in all the variances of that term will probably be the next big killer app that combines VR and AI. And I personally worry a lot about the degree of addiction such a game will have and the consequences on society.
Great. Okay, over here. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Melody, work for the World Economic Forum, the Digital Economy and Society team. Thank you for your sharing. I also learned that lately you have your new book out with the artificial intelligence, and today I got to learn your insights about AI, privacy, and many other new technology in the industry. My question to you is, so what's your view about the role of regulation in enhancing and cultivating an environment for innovation while finding the right balance for what's to regulate, what's not?
Yeah. I think regulation is clearly needed, and all the way from the privacy issues that came up earlier to the misuse of data to what basically is regulating. The regulation is largely over large companies with lots of power, I think, is needed. I think we should debate regulation on issues like, autonomous vehicles all the way to autonomous weapons. I think we're entitled to have different views, but that should be vetted. That's important. I also think the speed at which regulation will take to be vetted and passed by the various Congress or court or whatever, will tend to be too slow to have an impact. As we saw the Department of Justice in the US on Microsoft, the European Union on Google, they worked hard, but their speed just didn't match the speed at which technology and marketplace took. So I think we can't just rely on regulation. I think media, like courts, should supervise and expose issues to all of us. And one last point I would raise is that I really want to appeal to anyone on Facebook Live and here who think about open source. Because remember when we had the Wintel duopoly? We were all so frustrated. I worked at SGI and Apple. I could not get any innovation to happen. Ultimately, I interviewed at Microsoft and Intel and I got 2 job offers and I went to Microsoft. I gave in. But I watched with amazement that over the 10 years after I joined Microsoft, the open source movement, through the geek spirit in the world and open community and the spirit of sharing, through things like GitHub and also in parallel Wikipedia, it shows that wisdom of the crowd and that well-meaning normal people can take down these monopolies or companies with extraordinary power. So I hope in the space of AI there's some equivalent open source movement that doesn't just make the code base open, but also makes data more open so that academia can do advanced research, so that smaller companies can hope to compete against the giants.
So we're actually just about out of time. I'm going to ask one last question, which I want to come back to. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but you're welcome to stay after. You mentioned Elon Musk, and I think a lot of us, it's very easy, thanks to Hollywood, to conjure up a scenario, a very dystopian scenario where the robots have taken over and human beings are really no longer in control, and it's a violent and just sort of disturbing scenario. Often Arnold Schwarzenegger is in those movies. And,
yes.
And so my question is, can we keep Arnold Schwarzenegger around long enough to save us from this? Actually, my real question is, how concerned are you? Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, a bunch of very smart people have voiced pretty serious concerns about where this is all headed.
I think it's completely valid to voice concerns. All the concerns we raised were other concerns. I would prefer to focus on the concerns with certainty than the concerns that are hypothetical. But I do want to comment on that. I think today the engineering reality is that AI is just a tool that we control, a tool that we program. AI optimizes to an objective function that we tell it. It doesn't come up with that function. And we have the ultimate power to pull the plug from AI. So we've got a lot of control right now. I think we should be cautious not to give up that control. But today there's no sign, no engineering certain sign that AI is about to gain self-consciousness. All the extrapolation about number of neurons that could be equal singularity, I would say there is no engineering basis for that. There might be hypothetical belief, and people are entitled to that. So given that AI are just tools, I think we should focus on the problems of today. And I think I'd like to believe that AIs are just tools. 2, the tools will get better. 3, they'll displace jobs. 4, figuring out the job displacement solution is what we should focus our time on. And 5, I propose that service jobs with our heart is something AI cannot replace. So that would be an alternate ending to Elon Musk's story.
That's a great wrap-up to the discussion. I would add to your takeaways, fried chicken is coming on demand in 15 years. Fire your private banker and hire some algorithms. Neurotic New York parents shouldn't only force their kids to study engineering. And journalists should really keep working really hard to get better and better to outrun the AI that's going to inevitably replace us.
And one last comment is that based on your summary,
Yes.
You're not going to get replaced by AI.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. Thank
pleasure.
you to Kai-Fu Lee.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was fun.
Yeah, that was great. Really appreciate it.
Good.